Welcome to episode number 1 of Indie Cult Horror. This is going to be a collection of interviews that I shot in the early 2000s for a period of about 3 years while working on my master's. Let me give you a little bit of background on what I mean by that. Indie Cult Horror started when I was starting my master's degree. I was at the New School in New York City in a media studies program, and one of the first classes I took was a pre-production class where you had to pitch a project. So, as a collector and a fan of horror films, my project idea was, let's make extras without the movies. If you know, like me, you collect movies and you end up with the same movie over and over and over again just to get the different extras and special features. I'm looking at you, Anchor Bay. So, my thing was, you don't need me to buy the movie anymore. I just want to buy the new little features that I don't have already. So that's what this project was going to be. It was going to be a DVD series, and you could get just new interviews, new features, and don't need the movie anymore. Well, this day and age, we don't need DVDs anymore, so I decided to revisit these interviews because I've realized that some of the people I got to interview, unfortunately, are no longer with us, and some of them are not as accessible as they used to be. So I want to take this time online to share these interviews with you because I want people to see them. The reason why the project was named Indie Cult Horror is because I grew up a fan of films and hoping to be a filmmaker myself when I was growing up. So in the 90s, the people that were most important to me, right, as a filmmaker, George Romero, Sam Raimi, people like John Carpenter and Dario Argento. But on the other side, I was also really influenced by what was happening in the 90s in independent cinema. The Quentin Tarantinos, Robert Rodriguez, Richard Linklater, Kevin Smith, these people were just as important to me as my horror people. So what I wanted to look at was how those two kinds of things, on top of cult films, all intersected. And what it was that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, horror films and cult films, they were the independent cinema of America. So that's what indie cult horror is and means. But, so the first episode today, we're going to look at an interview I did with H.G. Lewis. When I started the project, as part of my background work for the project, I started looking at the local conventions in the New Jersey, New York area to see who was appearing. And I started emailing them. Now, H.G. Lewis was extremely accessible. And he corresponded with me back and forth, and we set a date, and he was going to be at Fangoria's Weekend of Horrors in 2003. So, that's what we're going to see today. My very first interview was with Herschell Gordon Lewis. If you don't know who H.G. Lewis is, before you watch this, you really need to take a moment and Google him. Well, I can't say I'm a fan of all of his films. He was extremely important in a way because he brought gore to the masses. He's the person who said, that's going to get people to come out and see something different, something new. And he was a marketing genius, and that's how it all worked for him. He understood the kind of P.T. Barnum, big circus aspect of independent and cult films. So H.G. Lewis, the creator of films like Blood Feast and 2000 Maniacs, he was very gracious, gave me a full hour of his time, and told me so many stories. So now you're going to get to hear those stories. So here it is, episode number 1, H.G. Lewis.
I'm Herschell Gordon Lewis. This is Saturday, January 11th in the year 2003.
Okay. First question I have for you, Mr. Lewis, is how does it feel to be known as the Godfather of Gore?
It's an awesome responsibility. One I never thought I would have to face when I was making these movies, because at the time, all I was trying to do was to make the kind of picture the major companies weren't making. That they have survived, that I have survived, it's thrilling to me. I'm enough of a child yet to find pleasure in that.
When did you exactly realize that you're kind of a cult icon?
What happened was that there was a period in which I felt I had been totally forgotten and the movies had fallen into a great dark hole somewhere. And one day, about 20 years ago, I had a phone call. And at the time, as now, I was in a totally different business. I felt that the world of motion pictures was behind me. The phone call was from a man named Rick Sullivan, who invited me to a horror film festival in New York and said, we're going to be screening The Wizard of Gore. And I said, where on earth did you find The Wizard of Gore? And we confounded each other. He didn't know what I meant. I certainly didn't know what he meant. He said, well, will you come? Well, it turned out that the timing was quite fortuitous then. I was under contract to write a book about the artist Norman Rockwell, who spent his last years in a town called Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And I had to go to Stockbridge to get some background. So I said to my wife, look, we'll go to New York. There we'll pay our way that far, so it'll help underwrite the trip to Stockbridge. And it'll be something like a Harvard Lampoon, where they won't throw things, but they'll have a good time at our expense. And we'll have a good time at their expense. And I still had no notion that there was anything serious to this, other than somebody may have found an errant print of this somewhere. Well, I came to New York, and they picked me up in a Rolls Royce they had rented for the evening. And I said, this is not what I had expected. A Yugo, maybe. I don't know they made Yugos then. We went to this little theater in Greenwich Village, and here were people with gore costumes and fake fangs and stage blood and severed arms and pieces that I would have given I wouldn't have given my arm for, but I sure would have liked to have when I was making these things with department store mannequins. And it wasn't a joke. There was some reverence there, which was embarrassing to me. In fact, that still is embarrassing because I know what I have in these movies. And that began this great renaissance, which has waxed and waned now up till the year 2003. The lid blew off about 3 years ago when a fellow named Mike Vraney, V-R-A-N-E-Y, who owns Something Weird Video out of Seattle, began to excrete these movies on DVD. I had long since lost control of these. I don't own anything anymore except the music rights. And the reason I own the music rights is when these films passed out of my possession, neither I nor anyone knew that the music rights are a separate set of rights. And one day I had a call from Jim Maslin, the fellow who had bought up 20 or 25 of my old movies in a burst of insanity. And Jim said to me, John Waters wants to use the opening of Blood Feast in a movie he's making. I said, let him. I've known John for a long, long time. In fact, John is in Blood Feast too. I said, let him. He said, well, they'll play the music. I said, so what? He said, I don't own that music, you do. Which may have been a tactical error, by the way, because I didn't know that I still owned it. I had to join BMI, and to this day, I get twice a year, it's enough for cigars, I suppose, a royalty check for this old music. But that's all I own. I don't own the movies themselves anymore. But since they've come out on DVD, a whole new generation of people have begun to look at these things, and I myself have come to a reality that I didn't have when I was making them. And that is, compared with a lot of the product one sees today, they're entertaining. And that may be why movies like Blood Feast and 2000 Maniacs and Calling Me Blood Red and The Wizard of Gore and The Gore Gore Girls and The Gruesome Twosome, A Taste of Blood, have survived. Here are movies that cost next to nothing to make with casts of nobodies, and you go into a video store, usually not Blockbuster, because Blockbuster won't take a movie that has anything above an R rating. And they're there. And I am here at this film festival, and they're selling them right and left. I think today, which is the first day of this, I've signed 300 autographs onto boxes of DVDs and video cassettes and Lord knows what else. How is it that these have been able to survive? So I no longer apologize for them, which is what I did for too many years. They are, I suppose, the precursors of the Halloweens and the Amityville Horrors and the Houses on Elm Street and the Texas Chainsaw Massacres and who knows, and the Screams. I make no claim for them on a technical level. From the viewpoint of entertainment, if one looks at 2000 Maniacs today, there is still entertainment value, where a great many movies of that vintage will have either aged or become deformed to a point where they are no longer regarded as entertainment, just curios. It might be that I myself am just a curio.
Well, we kind of spoke about this a little bit before, but why did you go into exploitation films to start?
The reason I went into exploitation films was a minor scar tissue I had when I first went into the feature film business. At the time, I owned a partial interest in a film studio in Chicago. We were shooting television commercials, business films, government films, and it's a highly competitive business, more so perhaps than features, because you're bidding on jobs against others who are going to do the exact same thing you're going to do. One day I was bemoaning my fate to a friend. He said, well, how do you make any money in your business? I said, the only way to make money in the film business is to shoot features. He said, why don't you shoot features? Which is like saying, why aren't you rich? Except that you do have some control over your own destiny. So armed with that bit of philosophy, I organized a company which we called Mid-Continent Films. And Mid-Continent shot 2 movies, The Prime Time and Living Venus. The Prime Time, I made every mistake a first-time filmmaker could make. I was the producer. I hired a director. Big mistake. The director was experienced in shooting beer bottles, but not in shooting people. I put myself at the mercy of somebody else's film studio. Another mistake. I shot with a union crew. Another mistake. And that was The Prime Time. I bought a script from somebody. Another mistake. Nonetheless, the picture opened, much to my astonishment. For the second movie, which was Living Venus, some of the naivete had disappeared. I directed that movie myself and had a greater amount of control over the content. The distributor of those 2 movies was a company called Modern Talking Pictures, or Modern Something, out of Chicago, who in turn acted as prime distributor for a bunch of sub-distributors around the country. That's where I met my future partner, Dave Friedman. He worked for Modern. And they began an intensive exploitation campaign to market these pictures, which was a tremendous education for me. The only thing that went wrong was that in the middle of all this, Modern Talking Pictures, or Modern Film Distributors, went out of business. They went bankrupt, owing my company, Mid-Continent Films, all the film rentals. Mid-Continent Films consisted of myself and every friend I had who would invest any money. So here's an O. Henry story. I had no friends, I had no studio. I had sold my studio to get my investment into those movies. And like the wedding guest at the Ancient Mariner, I was a sadder and wiser man, but it didn't help much. But that was the education for which I paid in order to get properly into the movie business. I got a job as a staff director at another film company in Chicago. And Dave Friedman, of course, was at loose ends because the company he worked for was totally out of business. One day, the world changed. Dave Friedman showed up at this place where I was working, and he said, Al Sack, who's a superannuated film distributor in Dallas, will give us $7,000 if we'll make a one-reel color film with pretty girls. Now, one reel is 1,000 feet of 35 millimeter film, about 11 minutes. $7,000. A Croesus fortune. Because I figured I could shoot the camera myself. Dave said he could get a bunch of girls for $50 a day. I could edit that thing. Filmmaking had no fears for me. I knew how to make a wipe using Clorox bleach. There was nothing I couldn't do with a camera, or so I felt. I would score the movie because the place where I was working had a piano, an organ, and a celeste. I felt I would go from instrument to instrument to have the background music. We didn't want any sync sound, so all it would be were these girls and music. And I felt the most it could possibly cost us, even including the raw stock and the processing, was maybe $2,000, which would give Dave and me $5,000 to split. I said, by all means. Ancient Greek drama had a device they called Deus ex machina, God from machine. And when an ancient playwright would write himself into a corner and couldn't figure out the plot, a god would come out in a basket and issue some edicts, and that would solve the plot line. My Deus ex machina was a fellow from a film laboratory who came to this film studio to see what was going on. He said, "What do you have working?" "Well, I got this one." I said, "Wait a minute." He said, "You're talking about one reel. If instead of one reel you make a full-length 70-minute feature, I'll make you a deal where we'll handle the lab work and no laboratory bills will be due until 90 days after we deliver the answer print." Which meant to me that my only expense would be the cost of the raw film. We could probably make the whole movie for no more than it would cost to make the one reeler, because we wouldn't have to pay for processing or work print. So I discussed this with Dave Friedman, and he agreed that that's what we should do. And that fellow, whose name has passed into history, was really the progenitor of all of this. We made a little movie called The Adventures of Lucky Pierre, with a knockdown comedian named Billy Falbo and a bunch of girls, and there was not much to it. It ran exactly 70 minutes, which is 6,300 feet of film. We only bought 8,000 feet of film to make this movie. Everything was in it. I said to one girl, "Stretch." She thought I said, "Scratch," and she scratched. We left it in. It made no difference, because one thing that Lucky Pierre taught me was, if you're having a good time, if you're not taking yourself seriously, the chance of audience involvement increases exponentially. And that's what's wrong with so much of the filmmaking we see today. It's subjective rather than objective. That's a different piece of philosophy. Well, as it turned out, we got the answer print of Lucky Pierre, and it's not like it is today where everything's computerized. The answer print was execrable. It was dark, it was light, it was all over the place, but it was a print. A man named Tom Dowd owned a theater in Chicago on the edge of the Loop called the Capri. And the Capri Theater played this kind of picture. The Capri opened Lucky Pierre with the answer print, which was embarrassing. It ran for 9 weeks. We made back everything we could possibly have invested in that 5 times over, paid off the laboratory, and suddenly we were solidly in business. Now that in turn began a domino effect, because Tom Dowd, as a theater owner, said to himself, with great logic, "Why should I pay these guys for a movie?" And of course, Dave always was proud of how little we spent. I tried to keep it a big secret. We were the whole crew on Lucky Pierre. I was the director and cameraman. Dave Friedman was the producer and sound man. And the actors on the sync takes, we had a handful of sync takes where you need a clapstick. They'd work their own clapstick, throw it aside, and start to act. There was no crew. We were it. I felt that that was not the kind of thing we wanted to make a big deal out of, but Dave did. So Tom said, "Why should I be paying these people? I can have my own movie." Besides which, he owned a theater, which meant that he could say to others, "I'll play your picture if you'll play mine." So Tom Dowd began to make movies. Well, of course, we had to make them for him. And I became the king of no-budget movie making. I had an ancient Volkswagen bus crammed with obsolete equipment. And whenever it would turn cold in Chicago, I'd say, Dave, let's make a movie for somebody. And he would find somebody, we'd come down to Florida where it was warm and shoot a movie. And that is how Blood Feast came to be. Blood Feast, of course, was the watershed picture, which is the reason that we're sitting here today. We were in Florida shooting a picture for somebody else, another no-budget picture. And I said, while we're here, let's shoot one for ourselves. We were staying at a place on the North Beach in Miami Beach called the Suez Motel, like the Suez Canal. Outside the Suez Motel, standing about, 6-7 feet high, was and is a fake cement sphinx. Now, I've been to Egypt and I've seen the original sphinx, but when you look up against the sky, whether it's the original or a hunk of cement, a sphinx is a sphinx. And that gave us the idea for an oddball picture that had an Egyptian overtone. And as you may know, Blood Feast is about a crazy Egyptian caterer named Fuad Ramses. A woman comes to see Fuad Ramses and says, Mr. Ramses, I'd like to have a party for my daughter, but I don't want it to be like anybody else's party. Madam, and he has the heavy, it was all done really as a joke. Have you ever had an Egyptian feast? She said, well, no, but has there been a party like that? Not for 5,000 years. It turns out that an Egyptian feast are the parts of young maidens, very hard to find in Miami, by the way, cut up and cooked. And the conclusion that made this picture what it was the decision to make the kind of film the major companies simply would not, under any circumstances, get through a camera lens. And we went to a little cosmetics laboratory in Coral Gables because when I shot Living Venus, there's a scene where the girl's father hits this fellow in the nose and the blood comes. It was purple. Now, Living Venus was black and white, but I felt purple blood would not do for color. We went to this cosmetics laboratory. We compounded this blood. As far as I know, they're still selling it, although I'm sure the industry has gone past that. And decided to really tear the lid off. Because that was the only way in which we could make the kind of movie the major companies would not make or could not make. As we were cutting Blood Feast, second thoughts came into everybody's mind, Dave Friedman's, everybody's. Because here we were in my little cutting room in the Wrigley Building in Chicago. I think that was before I was in the Wrigley Building. And people couldn't watch it. And it wasn't because they were watching a torn up piece of work print with grease pencil marks all over it. They simply had never seen anything like that. Now, in today's sophisticated ambiance, it's hard to throw ourselves back in time. At that time, the word that described this picture in everybody's description was outrageous. Some felt it was outrageous because the acting was so execrable. All right, fine. Others felt, but you see, I've seen Keanu Reeves, so how could acting be any more execrable? Some people thought it was outrageous because they simply had never expected to see this kind of thing on the screen. And the key scene in Blood Feast was the now infamous tongue scene, in which the lunatic reaches into a girl's mouth and pulls out her tongue. And that was difficult to shoot, not because we had any qualms about it, but because to get an entire tongue with all the glop behind it was impossible in Miami. There were no packing plants in Miami. We had to have it sent in from Tampa. And here was this tongue with all the stuff behind it. We found a girl with a great big mouth we could stuff it into, and we put in the tongue and our stage blood and some gelatin, and he pulls out the tongue and she goes, "Lach," and all this glop comes out. And that was a scene that, no matter how much dismemberment one has, that's different. In fact, about a year later, there was a fellow who owned a theater in the ghetto section of Chicago. Yeah, I played that movie, Blood Feast, he says, and here are these guys, and they're hooting and hollering and slashing the seats and shooting bullet holes in the screen. He says, on comes that tongue scene, all he sees is a bunch of white eyeballs. When we opened Blood Feast, it was with some diffidence. I didn't know whether the theater would be shut down by the authorities. I didn't know whether people would rise up in wrath saying, we want our money back. It was a crap game, a game of Russian roulette. We opened a theater in Peoria, feeling if we drop dead in Peoria, who will know? We didn't drop dead in Peoria. We killed them in Peoria. It was a drive-in theater. Cars were lined up for a mile down the road, and here are these cars coming in with 6 people in the car and 2 more in the trunk. And the word of mouth after one day was extraordinary. And suddenly a new genre of movie had been made. Now, we didn't look at it with such a historic point of view. But I said to Dave, what if we made a good one? And that's when we went to St. Cloud, which was in a sleepy little town near Orlando. It was now part of that Disney empire. I wish I'd bought real estate there. And we shot 2,000 Maniacs, about a small southern town that gets even for the Civil War. And to this day, that's my personally favorite picture of all the ones I've made. But that was the beginning of an explosion. We had the entire world of gore to ourselves for some years. And then a major company director named Sam Peckinpah discovered this. And he had equipment, he had devices, he had resources we couldn't match. Exploding clothing, for example. And I could see that our little world was about to be invaded by giants. And the end was near. And so the last movie that I shot was, until we made Blood Feast 2, was The Gore Girls, which began what I felt was a new cycle of satire and gore, where I felt the audiences should not or couldn't take it seriously. I couldn't believe anybody would take that movie seriously. Well, guess what? Many people did. Until the Renaissance. Because about 2 years ago, I was at a film festival in Baltimore, and they showed The Gore Girls, which I thought it was lost forever, by the way. It's strange how these things come home. And they understood it, and they laughed where they were supposed to laugh. And I said, oh, all I did was make it a generation too early. So that was how this whole type of movie came to be.
Kind of, don't know if we really touched on this one, but how about the negative reactions that you're getting, like the people who really were offended and
thought
yes. These were like
we had many, not critics, we had people who were horrified. How dare you? In fact, when we opened Blood Feast, I think it was in San Diego, the newspaper there ran some sort of a negative comment about it, and we got bombarded with hate mail. How they knew where we were was beyond me. But a whole bunch of mail came in over a period of 3 or 4 days, and the reason we knew it was orchestrated is it referred to us as you reckless men, and they spelled reckless W-R-E-C-K-L-E-S-S. And I said, well, no matter what they think of us, we're more literate than they are. Blood Feast caught censor boards unaware. At the time, there was no rating system. Each community, or each state, or each municipality had its own rating system, if any. There were lots of rules against nudity. There wasn't one nude frame in there. There was legislation against obscenity, not one 4-letter word in Blood Feast. There was nothing about gore, no one had ever done it. We were, believe me, the causes of a certain amount of frantic legislation or rule passing about how bloody a picture could be. In fact, it was only, and that was international. Only in, I guess in the last 4 or 5 years have my movies played in England legally. Until then, they had to show in film clubs, which I felt was somewhat hypocritical because a theater would declare itself to be a film club for the evening. And people, instead of paying admission, would join the club. But okay, if that's the way they wanted to do it, fine. Some newspapers joined the fray. I think it was the Louisville Courier-Journal who had quickly instituted a rule about the word blood in a title. Well, I didn't care. For that market, we called it Flesh Feast. But at the time, there was a movie called In Cold Blood, a Truman Capote story, with a now dishonored Robert Blake in it. And they were caught in this, like dolphins in a tuna net. They were caught. They couldn't use their title because the paper had instituted this rule. In some cases, where we would play in a city and in the suburbs, the city would knock out the gore, the suburbs would leave it in, and two people, I could see them comparing notes about this picture, because without the gore in Blood Feast, all we have was about 58 minutes of bad acting. So, yes, there was a lot of negative comment. To this day there is. We have a dichotomy in society today. We have gore hounds, we have people who don't care, and we have people who think the rest of us are mad. And that doesn't bother me at all.
You were saying before with your early films like Lucky Pierre and I believe like The Pill and things like that, you're kind of making them for other people. What was the big difference between doing what was like kind of typical exploitation films and then moving into like the gore and the horror films?
Well, the difference between other types of exploitation films and horror/gore was that we owned this generic type of movie. And once a theater decided to play this kind of picture, they came to us or nobody. That was the position we had. Whereas with things such as Lucky Pierre or even The Pill, which actually The Pill was made after the gore sequence started, was that there were many, many producers and directors grinding out that kind of hamburger. So I felt we had a super competitive position in the world of gore while it lasted.
And with the marketing campaigns for them, like the trailers, the kind of disclaimer attitude that they had.
Oh, yes. You see, if you saw the trailer, we used to call them the coming atrocity, for Blood Feast, here was a fellow against a red background, of course. Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to see some scenes from the most unusual motion picture ever to play in this theater. We urgently recommend, if you have a heart condition, or if you are with a young and impressionable child, please leave this auditorium for the next 90 seconds. Figuring if that didn't keep them there, nothing would. So the whole idea was one of salesmanship. The relationship between marketing and production is one that's overlooked, I think, by too many filmmakers today. Filmmakers fall in love with their product. They don't think in terms of entertaining the audience. To me, that's a crucial mistake, not just to the movie they're making, but to the entire world of filmmaking.
Did you feel that's something that your business background kind of lent to the horror film that hadn't been there before?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because I was used at the time, and I still am, that's what I do, I was used to selling things to the public who was not expecting to buy what I was selling. And that's the difference, really, between marketing a movie and simply releasing a movie. Here I saw Harry Potter with 7,500 prints. 7,500 prints. Each print cost half as much as a whole movie that I would make. So, you see, when you're in a murderer's row, as Blood Feast 2, the new movie is, you live on your wits or you perish, unless you have major studio backing behind you.
So the big question is then the big gap of time between the Gore Girls and the new movies that you're, like 2001 Maniacs, I believe you just executive produced. You really didn't have too much of
I don't
hand in
think
that.
2001 Maniacs is being made at all. The people who were supposed to make that movie, and I have had nothing to do with it, because Of all the movies I've made, as I told you, 2000 Maniacs is my favorite. If somebody wants to remake The Wizard of Gore, I'd be delighted. But these fellows have announced they want to make 2001 Maniacs, and they've been at it now for 3 years. And as far as I know, the production company has disbanded, so that may not occur at all. Blood Feast 2 is not necessarily an accident of history, although all these years have elapsed. What has happened is, over the years, since the rediscovery, I must have been approached 50 times, that's quite an understatement, by somebody who would say, let's make Blood Feast 2. I developed a defensive answer, which is, put your deal together and call me. And that effectively dismissed these people. They wanted to get their names in Variety, I don't know what. Until along came a man named Jackie Morgan. And I live in Fort Lauderdale, and I had a call from Jackie Morgan, whom I didn't know at the time, saying, I'm producing a movie here called Bully, which I had heard something about because it was a Fort Lauderdale story about these young fellows who killed their friend because he went out with the wrong girl. He said, can we get together for a cup of coffee? I said, sure. We sat down, and he said, I'm interested in making Blood Feast 2. All right. Put your deal together and call me. To my utter astonishment, about 2 months later, FedEx delivered a 100-page professionally written script. I said, don't tell me this man has put a deal together. And he called me. And Jackie said, what do you think of the script? I said, it's certainly professional, but I think in today's marketplace, if we're going to compete, we have to salt it with black humor. He said, well, give us some ideas. And I, feeling like a complete idiot, sat down and emailed him a long memo, and why I couldn't think of why I was doing this. I felt I was just wasting my time and his. Long memo with suggestions about what to insert in this script. 3 weeks later, I got a 120-page script from the writer, whose name was Boyd Ford, and all my suggestions were in there. And I said, can it be? About a week later, Jackie Morgan and Boyd Ford came to Fort Lauderdale. We met, we hammered out a deal, and the rest is about to be history, because now they have concluded a distribution deal on Blood Feast 2. Now, what is the difference between Blood Feast 1 and Blood Feast 2? The answer is not just years, light years. Number one, we had an effects fellow, Joe Castro, who's a professional gore effects person. I suspect that Joe Castro, as marvelous a technician as he is, his profession would not have existed if it weren't for Blood Feast. We had a crew of 35 people. Instead of being on the camera saying, okay, and an old rack over Mitchell, here was this magnificent, huge Panavision camera. And I sat in a canvas chair, and I was the director of roll sound. And I saw the images on a TV screen, so I could tell there's a microphone in the picture without waiting for the rushes that night. And the film speed is so much greater than it was that you don't need the amount of light we needed then. And I had professional actors. It was a totally different experience, a totally exhilarating experience for me to make Blood Feast 2. I didn't have to cut it. Somebody else cut this picture. So, yes, I may have been either the beneficiary or the victim of departmentalization there. But that, I said, is that what directors really do? So I had a wonderful time with that movie. And I think the results are superior compared to much product I see. Even within its extravagance, the cost of Blood Feast 2 is fractional compared with anything, Scream or one of those Dracula pictures. You could make 12 blood feasts for what any one of those cost.
So, but why did you take such a break? I mean, if it was a break even?
Well, because I felt the industry had gone beyond me. The smart marketer knows when to get out. It's like being at a pool table, and I'm playing pool against a bunch of paraplegics. I'm going to win. But here comes the hustler. If I'm smart, I give him my cue stick and say, play somebody else. And that's what happened in the movie business. I felt it was time to get out. And really it was at that time. Yeah, I couldn't predict what was going to happen. I certainly would not have given up control of these movies if I'd known how many video cassettes and DVDs were going to sell later on. But I don't regret it. I had a good time. I'm still having a good time. I'm enjoying my life. And here we are.
One thing you said about working on Blood Feast 2 that was different was professional actors.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've read a couple interviews with you where you said always use amateurs, you know. It's that kind of attitude about it.
Well, you see, when you're making a low-budget movie, cooperation is more important than talent. Talent is a mystery. It's a chimera. Do you go to see a movie because Meryl Streep is in it? She's a wonderful actress, but I don't know that I'd want to go to a movie because she's in it. I go to a movie to be entertained. One benefit that those of us who work in this strange byway of filmmaking have is that the effects are superior to acting talent. I don't think anybody ever walked out of Blood Feast, other than those who had come prepared to hate it, saying, gee, that acting is lousy. People have said that, but they didn't leave. And many people who said that bought the cassette or bought the DVD. Or when I've seen people here at this show who have said, I've seen Blood Feast a dozen times, which I haven't, by the way. So if you entertain people, there's a huge gap between dedicating yourself to entertainment and trying to make a movie which glorifies the talent of the actors. There were no lines of dialogue that justified that in Blood Feast, or for that matter in Blood Feast 2, or for that matter in almost any horror film. Yes, there's a certain benefit, I suppose, to star names if you're going to negotiate for playing time with theater chains. That luxury is denied me, and I accept it. So I live on a different plateau.
Working with the actors, did anyone ever have qualms dealing with the violence? I mean, from the actor's point of view, was there anyone who just flat out refused, or?
We never lost an actor because of that. When we were shooting the Gore Girls, an indication, by the way, no, I think it was The Wizard of Gore, pardon me, The Wizard of Gore, indication of the casual approach to filmmaking. I had a partner on the Gore Girls who was 1 year older than God, and we gave him the title executive producer. I was the producer and director. But he felt that a producer should have a hand in the actual shooting. The first day of shooting, and we shot the whole thing on locations. Very seldom did I have the luxury of a studio shoot. He got into an argument with a fellow we had hired to play the part of the wizard. This fellow said, I don't need this kind of crap, not for $50 a day, and he walked off. Now, in Hollywood, in quotation marks, circumstances, agents would get together, executives would get together, they'd lose maybe a half a day shooting time, and the thing would be restored. Not on my set. On my crew was a fellow named Ray Sager. I had used Ray Sager as both crew and cast because Ray was my kind of person. He was willing to act, he was willing to help. To me, a good actor was somebody who at the end of the day shooting would help pick up the cables. I said, Ray, you just became the Wizard of Gore, Montag the Magician. And Ray Sager played that part. Strangely, although he's a good actor, by the way, he's now a producer in Toronto or somewhere, but he had almost no manual dexterity, which the part called for, but so what? That is not germane to entertaining an audience. It's not germane to making a movie of this type. And it's once again not proof of anything other than my own opinion. My opinion is that if one keeps one eye on budget and one eye on those people out there, you're going to finish the film and someone's going to play it. If your eye is only on budget, you're not going to have that happen. If you are in awe of your cast, that isn't going to happen. So that is, I think, the difference between the kind of movies I made and some of the major company products. And I don't apologize for that at all.
Another thing with Wizard of Gore, the scenes in the cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading an interview and you're saying how those are real corpses. They just happened to be there and took advantage of it, and you know it was convenient. And the open grave and things like that. Again, did you have any problems with actors? You know,
No, you see, we cast down a gauntlet. It's not as though, not one of these Kubrick pictures where nobody knew what was going to happen. All you got were the parts you're in. Everybody knew what the movie was. One of the rules we established was that before we began to shoot, we ran through the entire script just as a reading and a discussion with all the crew there and all the cast there, so that everybody had some notion of what his part interfaced with others with. All the crew knew what was going to happen. That gave us something of an esprit de corps that you don't often find. So nobody ever said, I'm not going to shoot in a morgue or in a funeral parlor or in a cemetery. It was all part of the game. And we always did it in a way in which nobody felt that somebody's going to drop a corpse on him. It wasn't done that way at all.
Have you ever done a film and then afterwards felt like just ashamed of the finished product and
Always.
the quality and the...
That's an impossible question. There's not a film I've made I don't think I could have done better. You look at these things historically, absolutely. The movies, anybody who says I made a perfect movie is lying. But I think we got a lot of film for our money. And if you were to say to me, suppose you were to remake the movie you'd like to remake, The Wizard of Gore, and a major company were to give you a $30 million budget for it. Of course I'd make a better movie. I would make a movie with so much polish that it would make any $200 million movie, including Titanic, look sick, because it would be so slick. I don't think that's about to happen. I don't think this kind of movie justifies that kind of budget. So my answer is an absolute yes. There's not a movie I've made that I don't wish I could have made another way. But you see, that's not part of the game either.
The one film you always talk the most positively about, the one that's always been your favorite, is 2000 Maniacs.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I just want to know what's so endearing about that film.
First of all, I think the acting level of 2000 Maniacs is fairly good. I think the plot line holds together. I've sat in audiences enough times, anonymously, where that's the movie that grabs people. The first effect is held back. In most of my movies, there's an effect to open the movie. In 2000 Maniacs, you're about 20 minutes into the movie before that thumb comes off. And people jump when that happens. There's a psychological reaction to 2000 Maniacs that I haven't seen in many other people's movies either, for that matter. Aside from which, that's the one in which I played the biggest role. I was the director, I was the cameraman, I wrote the music for that, and I put the whole picture together, so I was very pleased with what happened with that movie. We had half the town of St. Cloud in that movie, too.
You were just saying how you wrote the music to that film. I noticed that in the credits to the films that I was watching, that your name popped up in the music one way or another. Your musical background, I've never heard anything said about that.
Well, I haven't made much of a point of it. In fact, in some cases, it'll say music by Sheldon Seymour, which is the name I made up. What happened originally, I had no intention of doing this. We shot Blood Feast, and I knew I could not use canned music for that movie. The only thing that came close was a suite by a British composer named Gustav Holst called The Planets. But I had no rights to that movie, to that music rather. It would have cost a fortune to use that as background music. I didn't know what to do. I was getting prices from people, and the prices for scoring the picture were twice what it cost to shoot the picture. I said, this is insane, I can do this. I knew what I wanted. I wanted weird effects. I wanted a cello, which is in the bass clef. I wanted a trombone. I wanted weird chords on the organ. I said, I can do that. And in fact, scoring the picture, of course, took longer than shooting it. That's no surprise, because my musical background is sketchy. I certainly do not claim to be Beethoven. I am a dabbler. I'm a dilettante in music. But I knew enough how to score that for a handful of instruments. And when we scored that, when we recorded that music, I had rented kettle drums and didn't even think about getting a kettle drummer. I don't know why. It was not a deliberate thing. And we showed up to record this music, and here was my cello player, and here was my trombonist, and I had my old friend Larry Wellington, who was going to play the piano and the organ. We didn't have a kettle drummer. So I played the kettle drums. I thought nothing of it, by the way. In fact, when the famed conductor Leopold Stokowski was trying to get into the musicians union, he played no instrument. So he qualified on the kettle drums. There's nothing, I don't mean to denigrate the capability of kettle drummers, but in a case like this, where I knew exactly what I wanted to do and didn't have to look at notes, really. All I had to do was tune those drums to the right key. It was nothing. I did not regard myself as an auteur, nor did I regard myself as a composer. I regarded myself as somebody who was saving a lot of money by scoring that picture. So when we came to 2000 Maniacs, for the main theme of this movie, which has now become somewhat famous and somebody just re-recorded it again, I had hired a group to record that. And it opens with this Rex Harrison type sing-song. There's a story you should know from 100 years ago. Well, in came this group, and their lead singer was close to falsetto. There's a story. Wait a minute. I said, it's got to be much more macho than that. So I had the deepest voice in the room, and of course I knew the tempo of it. So I recorded that with my voice. The credits don't say that that's my voice on that sing-song, and I didn't think anything about it. It was simply the way to save some money. Yes, once again, history has treated me very kindly in that respect. And every now and then when I'll be appearing before somebody or other, they'll say, hey, let's do the theme song from 2000 Maniacs. And I still remember every word. And it's one of the happiest moments of my day when that happens. But it was not done out of ego. It was done out of a simple desire not to spend a lot of money.
I think we've pretty much covered everything. Yeah, I think that's pretty much everything I had in mind.
I'll conclude this by saying this has been a very pleasant and intensive interview, and I certainly appreciate your doing this because it makes me feel good when someone has this kind of interest. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, there you have it. That was episode 1 of Indie Cult Horror. I hope you enjoyed my interview with Herschell Gordon Lewis, and I look forward to seeing any comments or any shares or likes, any of those fun things that we can do these days, huh? But coming up, I don't want to give you any spoilers, but we do have many big names to come. Hope you enjoyed, and hopefully I'll see you back here in about a month. Thanks.